Vinashaya cha dharmasya sarvadharmasvarupine avatara varishtaya Ramakrishnaya te namaha. One of the things that's most unique about the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna is that it's full of humor. That's something that anybody who reads just a few pages of the Gospel will find. On almost every page you'll find statements like, everybody laughs, laughter. And Sri Ramakrishna is always making jokes. The devotees are always laughing. There's a kind of atmosphere of joy. It's quite unique. And this reminds me of something Swami Medhanandaji said. He said, religion is not for dyspeptics. So many people think that to be religious you have to be very serious, you have to have a long face. And Sri Ramakrishna was exactly the opposite. He was always joyous. And he would tell jokes. And so in this lecture and in the next lecture, what I want to explore is the spiritual significance of Sri Ramakrishna's humor, the way that he used humor in different ways towards spiritual ends. And it's a vast topic, the topic of Sri Ramakrishna's use of humor. But in this and the next lecture, I'll focus on 3 of the main ways that Sri Ramakrishna used humor. So the first way is that he used humor to explain very subtle or very difficult philosophical and spiritual ideas. That's what I'll focus on in today's lecture. But there are 2 other uses that I noticed in the Gospel. He also, sometimes you'll find, he uses humor as a gentle, kind of indirect means of scolding people. I'll explain this in the next lecture, and of pointing out flaws in a person's character, or pointing out ways that a person is being egoistic. So that's another different use of humor that you'll find in the Gospel. And a third use of humor is that he sometimes uses humor to express his love toward others and as a means of bringing different people together. So I'll just focus on this first use of humor today, and in the next lecture, part 2 of this topic, Sri Ramakrishna's divine humor, I'll discuss the second and third uses of divine humor. So let's focus today on how Sri Ramakrishna uses humor to explain difficult philosophical and spiritual ideas. So I'll just give you a few examples. So the first example, on one occasion in the Gospel, Sri Ramakrishna's neighbor visits him, and his neighbor asks him a very difficult question. The neighbor asks, why has God created wicked people? So the neighbor is raising one of the most difficult philosophical questions. It's called the problem of evil. The problem is this: if God is all loving, and if God is omnipotent, if he is all powerful, then why is there so much suffering in this world? Why is there so much evil? If God were really all loving, why wouldn't he prevent all this suffering? That's the question. So this is a very difficult philosophical question that the neighbor is asking Sri Ramakrishna. And this is how Sri Ramakrishna answers the question. Sri Ramakrishna says, that is his will, his play. In his Maya, there exists avidya, ignorance, as well as vidya, knowledge. Darkness is needed too. It reveals all the more the glory of light. There is no doubt that anger, lust, and greed are evils. Why then has God created them? In order to create saints. In Bangla, the original Bangla, Sri Ramakrishna says, Mohat lok toyar korben bole. A man becomes a saint by conquering the senses. Is there anything impossible for a man who has subdued his passions? He can even realize God through his grace. Again, see how his whole play of creation is perpetuated through lust. And then he says, wicked people are needed too. There is need of everything. Once Sita said to her husband, Rama, it would be grand if every house in Ayodhya were a mansion. I find many houses old and dilapidated. But my dear, said Rama, if all the houses were beautiful ones, what would the masons do? Laughter. And everybody starts laughing. Sri Ramakrishna tells this very humorous story, and then everybody laughs. Now, what I want to explore is what is the nature of this joke, this story that Sri Ramakrishna tells, and how is it relevant to the answer that he's giving to this very difficult question about the problem of evil? So notice that Sri Ramakrishna first, in the first paragraph, he gives a somewhat abstract philosophical response to his neighbor's question. What he says is, in this world, God has made it such that there has to be both good and evil. You cannot just have good. You have to have a balance of both good and evil. And he explains that the reason why is that if we don't encounter evil qualities like lust and greed and jealousy and other things, we won't feel the need to grow morally, and we won't feel the need to evolve spiritually. That's the idea. That's the main idea. But it's a very abstract philosophical point that Sri Ramakrishna is making. So then he immediately goes on to tell a humorous story about Sita and Rama. And the story is very interesting. He uses it as a way to make more vivid and to make more dramatic and more direct that philosophical point that he's already making. So what he's saying is, so Rama tells Sita, if all the houses in Ayodhya were mansions, and if they were perfect and they didn't need any repairs, then there would be no work for the masons to do. So this is Sri Ramakrishna's humorous way of explaining that we need evil qualities in order to prompt us to bring out the good qualities in ourselves and in other people. That's the basic idea. It's also similar to something that Swami Vivekananda said when he was giving spiritual classes in the US. One American devotee complained to him. He said, Swamiji, why do these lustful thoughts come up in my mind sometimes? And then Swamiji says, unless one has a temper, one will have nothing to control. This is a very profound response. Unless you have a temper, you won't have anything to control. I think Sri Ramakrishna is saying something very similar. The idea is, it's because we have the Shat Ripu, these 6 enemies within us, Kama, Krodha, Lobha, and these other things, God is kind of testing us. It's a kind of spiritual trial. Or another way that Swamiji put it is, this world is a moral gymnasium in which we have to exercise our moral and spiritual muscles. And that's the way that we grow strong spiritually and morally. So this is just one example of how Sri Ramakrishna uses humor to illustrate and to make more vivid a very profound philosophical point about the need for both good and evil in God's Leela. So that's the first example. Here's another example. Sri Ramakrishna, I mentioned this in a number of previous lectures. Sri Ramakrishna often talks about the spiritual experience of vijnana as opposed to jnana. And he says that the vijnani is somebody who realizes both the personal and the impersonal aspects of God, and he sees that God has become everything in this world. So in this context, Sri Ramakrishna says, the vijnani further sees that what is Brahman, Nirguna Brahman, is the Bhagavan, the personal God. He who is beyond the 3 gunas is the Bhagavan with his 6 supernatural powers. Living beings, the universe, mind, intelligence, love, renunciation, knowledge. All these are the manifestations of God's power with a laugh. So now he brings in humor with a laugh. If an aristocrat has neither house nor property, or if he has been forced to sell them, one does not call him an aristocrat anymore. All laugh. God is endowed with the 6 supernatural powers. If he were not, who would obey him? All laugh. So this is very important that Sri Ramakrishna is making a very profound spiritual statement about what is the nature of the spiritual realization of the vijnani, the highest kind of realized soul. And he's saying that the vijnani realizes that Nirguna Brahman is one with Shakti, with the personal God. And then he explains why. Why is that the case? And he uses this kind of humorous example to explain why. He says, see, an aristocrat, we only call an aristocrat because he has a lot of property and he has a lot of money, a lot of wealth. If you take away the money and the wealth and the property, he's no longer an aristocrat. Actually, there's a very subtle philosophical point behind this humorous example. And one way that I can bring this out is to point out that I don't know how many of you are familiar with Kashmiri Shaiva philosophy. It's a tantric philosophical school, Kashmiri Shaivism. And one of the most famous philosophers in that tradition is Abhinavagupta. He was a medieval philosopher. And he made a very similar point, because in the Tantra and Kashmiri Shaiva traditions, Shiva and Shakti are abheda. Shiva, so they call it Prakasha Vimashamaya. So the ultimate reality is both Prakasha, it's pure consciousness, it's the Nirguna side, and it's also Vimashamaya, which means it's also dynamic and it's also personal. So Abhinavagupta, he makes exactly the same point that Sri Ramakrishna makes. Abhinavagupta says in Sanskrit, Asthasyat ekarupena vapusha chet maheshvaraha Maheshwaratvam samvitvam tat atyakshat ghatadivat. So the translation would be, Abhinavagupta saying, if the highest reality did not manifest infinite variety, but remained cooped up within its solid singleness, it would be neither the highest power nor consciousness, but something like a jar, J-A-R, jar, ghatavat, ghatadivat. So Abhinavagupta is saying, if the ultimate reality was just pure consciousness, only transcendent, then it would be just as powerless as an insentient object, like a table or a jar. And Sri Ramakrishna similarly, by using this joke about an aristocrat, he's saying that if God didn't have the power to manifest as this world, what kind of God would he be? He needs to have power to be a true God. That's the same idea. So again, you find Sri Ramakrishna using humor to explain very subtle philosophical ideas. Another example, in another place in the Gospel, Sri Ramakrishna explains the subtleties of God's creation. How does God create this world? And again, you'll find that he's using humor. So this is what Sri Ramakrishna says. He says, after the destruction of the universe, at the end of a great cycle, the Divine Mother garners the seeds for the next creation. She is like the elderly mistress of the house. So in Bangla, the word is ginni. So the elderly mistress of the house who has a hodgepodge pot in which she keeps different articles for household use. All laugh. Everybody's laughing because it's a very funny example. Oh yes, housewives have pots like that where they keep sea foam, blue pills, small bundles of seeds of cucumber, pumpkin, and gourd, and so on. They take them out when they want them. In the same way, after the destruction of the universe, my Divine Mother, the embodiment of Brahman, gathers together the seeds for the next creation. After the creation, the primal power dwells in the universe itself. She brings forth this phenomenal world and then pervades it. In the Vedas, creation is likened to the spider and its web. The spider brings the web out of itself and then remains in it. God is the container of the universe and also what is contained in it. The original Bangla, he says, God is both adhara and adheya. So Sri Ramakrishna is making two very important philosophical points about God's creation here. The first point is he's explaining what is the nature of pralaya. There's sisti, sthiti, and pralaya. Creation, preservation, destruction. What happens when this universe is destroyed? Well, Sri Ramakrishna says it's not destroyed in the normal sense. This entire universe contracts into seed form. It becomes in bija rupa. And then he uses this really funny example of an elderly mistress, a ginni, who has a kind of a small pouch with her, and she keeps many different small items together. So in the same way, he's explaining that pralaya is when God, this entire world is kept in this kind of, in the seed form. That's the first idea that he's explaining in this humorous way. The second idea is he's adding that it's very important to note that God is both the nimitta karana and the upadana karana of this world. These are technical philosophical terms, but he's explaining it in a very simple way. So nimitta karana means instrumental cause, and upadana karana means material cause. So one simple example is when a potter makes a pot out of clay, the potter himself or herself is the instrumental cause, and the clay is the material cause. So most Vedantic schools, except for Madhva Vedanta, they maintain that Brahman, God, is both the instrumental cause and the material cause of the universe. So Sri Ramakrishna says both adhara and adheya. He says that God not only creates this world, but also becomes this world. So Sri Ramakrishna directly quotes Mundaka Upanishad 1.1.7 here about the spider in the web. The Sanskrit verse is yathorana nabihi srijate grinnade cha tathaksharat sambhavati havishvam. So just as a spider, it creates a cobweb, but that cobweb comes out of itself. So in that sense, the spider is both the instrumental cause and the material cause of this cobweb. In the same way, God creates this universe. He creates this world, and he also becomes this world. The world itself is God. So you'll find that Sri Ramakrishna explains these very difficult ideas using humor and using these examples of, simple examples of a spider and a cobweb. And I'll just give one more example. In another place in the Gospel, Sri Ramakrishna distinguishes two kinds of bhakta, two kinds of devotee. He says one type of bhakta is a sattvika, and another type is Rajasika. And he gives very funny examples to explain these two different types of bhakta. Sri Ramakrishna says, similarly, bhakti, devotion, has its sattva. A devotee who possesses sattva, meditates on God in absolute secret, perhaps inside his mosquito net. Others think he is asleep. Since he is late in getting up, they think perhaps he has not slept well during the night. His love for the body goes only as far as appeasing his hunger, and that only by means of rice and simple vegetables, simple greens. There is no elaborate arrangement about his meals, no luxury in clothes, and no display of furniture. Besides, such a sattvika devotee never flatters anybody for money. An aspirant possessed of Rajasika bhakti puts a tilak on his forehead and a necklace of holy Rudraksha beads interspersed with gold ones around his neck. All laugh. At worship, he wears a silk cloth. So this shows Sri Ramakrishna's genius at explaining difficult spiritual ideas using humor and using these very vivid examples with great detail. So here you find that using humor, he explains in a very nice way that the Sattvika Bhakta is somebody who, there's no outward show, He worships God in private where nobody else knows that he's worshiping God. And they think he's lazy, he wakes up very late. But that's because he was doing sadhana all night. But he won't tell other people that. And the Rajasika Bhakta is the exact opposite. He wants people to know, look how great a sadhaka I am. Look at how I'm wearing this big japa mala with these gold jewels strewn in between. So this is another way that Sri Ramakrishna uses humor and vivid language and vivid examples to convey spiritual ideas. Next week, I'll continue this discussion of the way that Sri Ramakrishna uses divine humor. There are two other ways that he uses humor, so this is to be continued. Let us pray to Sri Ramakrishna, Holy Mother Sharada Devi, and Swami Vivekananda that we derive more and more joy in our daily spiritual practices and that we find less and less joy in the things of this world. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.